Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Build DeSo with Kenny J. And today we are finally going to get to the tutorial on programming with the DeSo identity. Everyone's been asking for this, and I'm happy that we're finally getting to this. I'm sorry it took a while, but I had to build a few things to make sure that I understood it so that I could present it properly. Okay, first let's talk a little bit about DeSo's two main APIs. Now, the one they call the Backend API is the one that we've been using in all the other tutorials, both in Python and in JavaScript. And it's these RESTful services that we've been using in order to get all the posts for a given user, to get the NFTs for a given user, to be able to search for users, all of those things that we're interacting with the blockchain. Identity has a few functions. The two main ones is that it allows a person to log into a website and then your code will know who it is so that you can do stuff on their behalf. The second very important thing, and what we'll go over also in this tutorial, is signing transactions. And we'll understand why this is different than when we signed transactions on a backend server, like using Python. So some of the backend API server calls that we have already used, or the API calls we've already used, get user stateless. We use that to be able to search for a person, get single profile. So we were able to get the information back if we had their profile ID. Get posts stateless. We're able to get the post like it says. Also, if we had their public key, I called it an ID. It's their public key. We can get all their posts. We also can get the NFTs for a user. All of those things we've already done before. And there's a whole lot more. If you go through that documentation, you'll see there's a whole lot more, and maybe over time we'll explore a lot more of those. The identity API is a very small set, and I think it's intentionally that way. It's just not meant to do that many things, but the most important things we'll be working with today is logging in, and then down here, signing a transaction. We will also use the logout. So maybe we'll go over these other ones in other tutorials, but those are the three biggies that we'll work on today. And as we've learned with the backend, a lot of these calls, this backend API, we can do a lot of read-only calls. And in the last tutorial where we used JavaScript, that's what we did. We were just using these read-only kind of calls, because if we need to actually post something, that's considered a transaction. We need to write it to the blockchain. That's when we need to be able to sign transaction and then submit that transaction, like those two different steps in order to get it to stick. Now, within the identity API, there's two parts to that. Let's take a look. So if we go up to here under identity, they'll give us an introduction, but we'll see they have a window API and an iframe API. And those are used together. It's not like, oh, either or. I mean, there's a use case where you could just get away with window API if it was very limited. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But generally speaking, you use both of these in conjunction with each other. And notice this is window, not windows. We're not talking about the operating system. We're talking about that pop-up window that you should be familiar with already. When you first created your account in DeSo, you got this window that popped up that lets you create your account. And then if you ever go to a new app that's built on DeSo, you log in and you'll get this pop up, and you get to, if you have more than one user, you'll get to choose which username. You click on that and then you're logged in. So that's what we mean by window. And then iframe is we will have to embed just a little bit of code into whatever web front end you have in order to get these to work together. And so, like I said, this window API, that's this that we should be familiar with. And then the iframe API is this little snippet of code, this iframe that we will place inside of our web app in order for everything to work. And within this window API, this is where we get the login, the logout, the approve. That's sometimes some of the sites you've been to, maybe you want to transfer an NFT and you'll get the pop-up window again, even though you've already signed into the account, you'll get the pop-up again and it'll say, do you really, do you approve this transaction? It'll cost you 0.0003 pennies or whatever. And you click approve and then it goes through. So that's what that is. And then within the iframe, the one that we are going to focus on today is this sign endpoint. And that allows us to assign a transaction. Okay, so first let's take a look at this window API and see what happens when we go through the login endpoint. So first, when your page loads up, you should have some code that will create an event handler that will listen for message events. And we'll go over that a little bit later. And then next, you would have some sort of facility such that if a user clicked on a button, it would call this code to open up this window, this pop-up. And that's the one that we saw. So that's step 2. Now, what happens is when that window opens, it will send back to your site on this listener you just set up a message, and it's going to be an initialize message. So your site's going to get that and it's going to say, okay, I've established communication. It's going to, as I say, it's going to catch that initialize message coming back from identity.deso.org. And it's going to store a reference to this object that you'll use for further communication. You'll get some other stuff back too, but that's kind of the most important thing. And then meanwhile, this window is still open, so your user is going to interact with it, and then they'll click on what profile they want to log in with. And when they do that, identity.deso.org will send a message back to your app, and your app's going to catch this message, which this time is going to be a login message. I know I'm doing air quotes a lot. Maybe that's dumb. But anyway, first we had an initialize message. Now we get a login message. And along with this, we will get the user's public key and some more identity information and their encrypted seed hex. Now I pause there because if you remember back to our tutorial where we were using Python, we had a seed hex there. And if I showed that seed hex to you and you copied it down, you could go drain my account of all the money. So that is like a super password that you would never want anyone to have. And so as you can imagine, that would be very dangerous for identity.deso.org to send back our unencrypted seed hex. But what it sends back is an encrypted seed hex. So how does that help it? Well, what's interesting is this encrypted seed hex is encrypted based on your particular browser on your particular computer. So that means even if you had 2 different browsers open, like I have Chrome open and I have IE or Edge or whatever, I went to the same website, I logged in on both of them, each browser would get a different encrypted seed hex. I've already tested this. So, and also if you went to another computer, another laptop, maybe you have 2 and you logged into a DeSo site, the encrypted seed hex that comes back there is also going to be different. So this is not as scary, right? Because in order for a person to use this now, they don't just need to know the encrypted seed hex. They have to somehow break into my computer and then figure it out and then go through. And once they've broken into my computer, it's probably easier for them to go to my online bank and just drain my money that way. So anyway, okay, we'll get a little bit more into that later on with this encrypted seed hex, but that's the basic flow. Okay, let's go back. So that was window API and that was login. Now the other important one we want is this iframe sign. So let's take a look at that one. Okay, in this one, we are going to create a post which will show up on our feed. And if we remember, there's three parts. First, you access the backend API, you create post, and then it comes back with a transaction hex, and then you need to sign the transaction hex, and then you need to post that transaction to the blockchain. So there's the three parts: create the post, sign the transaction, submit the transaction. What we're going to talk about right now is that middle part, the signing. So we're going to assume that the user has already hit submit. And so we already went to backend API to create the post, and it came back with a transaction hex. So now what we'll do is within our iframe API, we're going to post a sign message, a signed transaction message, and it's going to send it to our embedded little iframe. The iframe will receive that message and do some mathy stuff based on stuff within that particular browser so that it can decrypt that encrypted seed hex and then sign the transaction. And then it sends that signed transaction hex back, and our app can then take that and submit the transaction using the signed transaction hex. All right, so put another way, let's go through that process once again, just to make sure that we can see what's going on. So number one, our front end web app would initiate the login by going to Identity API, logging in, and it would get back a public key and an encrypted seed hex. Next, we would use that public key and the data that we want to post to the blockchain to submit the post, and it would come back with a transaction hex. Next, we would take that transaction hex and the encrypted seed hex that we had already got from logging in and send it to the Identity API to the signed transaction, and then it would send back a signed transaction hex. And then we go down here and we send that signed transaction hex to the backend API, and then it sends back the data that got posted just so we can confirm that it all went fine. Okay, and as you can see, that's a little bit more complex than what we were doing before with a backend server, which was we would post the public key with the data to the backend API, come back to our backend server, and we would have the code, that mathy stuff, that would allow us to sign the transaction hex based on the seed hex that we had. And then it would send that to the backend API as a signed transaction and would come back with post data. And if you're wondering why it's a little bit more complicated on the front end than on the back end, I come up with a kind of a dumb little metaphor here. But if we think of it this way, our backend server, it's kind of like a cabin in the woods, locked up, off the grid, unlisted address, and your good stuff, your money's all inside, but it's well protected, right? And that's why our seed hex, we feel a little bit more comfortable about it being on our backend server. Now, of course, we are going to be as secure as we can. We'll usually put it in an environment variable so that it doesn't get written in plain text to our public repository, to GitHub or whatever. But with that seed hex, let's say it's my seed hex, that limits me to only being able to post on my profile, right? But that's not very useful for a web app. A web app, we've got 100 users that are going to want to come in and post on their profiles. And I'm not going to be able, I don't want to get their seed hexes, or, well, if I'm a bad guy, maybe I do. But this is the way I like to think of front-end web apps. So instead of a cabin in the woods away from everyone, here we've got like this multi-house garden tour in a city. Like, I got a little brochure here. I think this is in Maine. I've been to one before. My wife and I went to one in the Garden District in New Orleans, and it was a lot of fun. But in this particular metaphor, we have a whole bunch of houses, right, that are on this route, and hundreds of people come in and they visit the houses, and the addresses are listed in a directory, and the doors are wide open, and they have, cookies and lemonade. And in my stupid little metaphor, every visitor has all their money right there on them. Their pockets are full of cash. And they're going in and out of every single house. Now, in this house and garden tour, most of the homeowners are perfectly honest. But what happens if one of them, just one, is a skilled pickpocket? And every visitor who comes by their house, they can deftly take the money out of their pockets. Well, that's kind of how I see the web. It is open. We've got lots of visitors. And if the unencrypted seed hex was available to my website, I'm a good guy. I'm going to ignore it, right? But there's going to be that person who's going to be like, oh, I'm going to email that to myself, right? And so all of a sudden, every visitor who comes to their website, the bad guy gets their seed hex and is draining their account while they're still just, going on the website, enjoying themselves. So anyway, that's kind of why we have that extra bit of security on the front end. And it makes it a little bit more difficult than when we were doing stuff on the back end. Good? Makes sense? All right. Okay, how about we do some coding? Let's start off. We're going to use Replit this time. Okay, we'll go to Replit. We'll create a new REPL. What we're going to do is React, and we're not going to do the TypeScript. I'm just going to do vanilla JavaScript. We'll call this Gmap base, new, and create REPL. And then I'm going to go to packages. And I'm going to install these 4 libraries. So this is Material UI. I'm not a great UX guy, so I lean heavily on Material UI, and it's going to require Emotion React and Emotion Styled. And then also I'm going to install the Axios library so that I can make HTTP requests. So what do? We go to packages. I'm going to type MUI. There we go, material. I'm going to hit the plus, and I'll go ahead and do that for the other 3 that we have left. Okay, I've got those installed, and I come up with just this rudimentary React app. You hit start, it'll come up, and we can see right there its default start screen. And if we want to see it in a full browser tab, we can go over here and click that, and we can see this right now. Yay. We can do a hot reload. So I can just add Kenny is great. And it shows up right there. And if I go over here, there it is. Okay. But we're not going to use this. I went ahead and created just an outline of what I want. So I don't have any of the DeSo code. I just have the Material UI code going on. When it says login here, I'm not really logging into anything. It's just a button that when I click it, it displays this. So I have a logout button. It's just toggling back and forth. Right now it's saying good morning, person whose public key is, and I just have this dummy public key right now. When we actually hook it up to DeSo, you'll see this change. And then send a good morning to Melanie J. I have that defaulted right here. You can see that. And then if I click on send GM, send a good morning, right now, all I have is a little alert that says, I will eventually create your post. Okay. So what is this little app we're doing? Well, if you remember a few years ago, there was an app called Yo, which it was an app where you just sent the word yo to someone else. And then Silicon Valley, the TV show, made fun of it. And there was an app called Bro. And so you would just send a bro to someone and they would bro you back. And I was thinking, well, we should do our own version for DeSo. What is our equivalent? And I think GM is what I see the most. Everyone's wishing each other a good morning. What this will do is when I hit send GM, it is going to post the text GM at Melanie J on my feed. Remember, I logged on, so it's going to post it to my feed. But of course, Melanie J will be notified in her notifications because I mentioned her, right? Super brilliant. app. I know I'm going to make a gajillion dollars. I'm really, really excited about this. Okay, let's build it together and then you can compete with me and then we can both become millionaire dollar people. Okay, so let's just look through the code real quick. What am I doing here? I'm importing a few UI elements from Material UI. I'm creating some hooks. I just call them state variables. That's how I think of them. I'm declaring 4 different state variables: logged in, to username, message, public key. And then I'm creating the setter. Whenever I need to change the value of this variable, I use this function, set login, set to username. And when I initiate this one, logged in is false. The username right here is Melanie J. That's who I'm going to mention. My message down here is waiting for you to send your GM. And the public key, initially I set it to null. And then when I logged in, I set public key to this dummy value. And you can see that right there. And all of this right here is just the UI stuff that's showing up here. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, I created a couple kind of helper files for myself, and they'll be available to all of you. You can go to the Replit, and they're just going to be 2 simple libraries, one for identity, one for backend API. The one for the backend API, we used it in our last video, so I'm just borrowing from myself, stealing from myself there. The identity one, though, I stole it from someone else, and I want to give them credit. So Mubasharik Ball, who just goes by Mubs, created this one. And so I took a lot of his code and changed a few things around, but I'd like to give a shout out to Mubs for that. And then also out here on GitHub, Bogdan Didenko took Mubs's and then created a React button, which I'm not using, but he did a couple improvements to Mubs's code. And so I integrate those 2. Okay, so I'm going to add this code. What I'll do first is I'll create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it libs for libraries. And here I'm going to add a new file, and I'm just going to call it DeSo identity.js. And I am going to copy and paste the code, and you guys can go through it yourself. So remember I said we have to add that listener. That's going on right here. The listener ends up acting kind of like a traffic cop, right? So we'll get back an initialize message and we'll want to do something with it. We'll get back oh, I just signed the transaction message. We'll want to do something with that. If our user doesn't have the right access level, like maybe we only had them log in with level 2, but they want to post a message, well, they're going to have to get that pop-up. And that's what this does. Well, if we get a approval required message back, then we're going to have to do that. And then finally, we're dealing with the user logged in and we'll want to have something handle that. So that's what's going on in this code. And I wrapped it all in a class. We're going to first import it in there. And then because I want to be able to instantiate this class right when the page loads and retain its state so that I can continue to use it, I'm going to create a use state hooks, which I just like to call a state variable and its setter called DeSo identity. And in order to handle that on load event, I'm going to use the use effect hook. So this is where I'm going to go ahead and instantiate our identity API objects. I'm just calling it DI. And then I'm going to set our state variable DeSo identity right there. So now we will be able to use this throughout the rest of our code in order to talk to DeSo identity. And then one last thing that we'll do to make it work so that the person can actually see the login box and all that'll happen is we'll go ahead and we will call this login async, but because it's async, see how it's getting mad at me? We have to remember now to make this an asynchronous method. There we go. But when we get back our information, we don't want to write just that dummy string. We want to actually write the user's public key. So we will do just that, except I will spell it correctly. There we go. Now let's go ahead and see what happens. I click login, and off on another window, I got this. There we go. And you can see I've got my 4 accounts to choose from. And if I scroll down, we'll see I've got a green check here. It's asking for my basic information and the ability to post, message, like, and follow on my behalf. So let's click Kenny J test. And you can see now it filled out with my public key, just like I told it to do. And why did it give us that access level 3? Because I told it to. If I change this to 2, let me log out, log back in again. Just, you can see I don't have anything hidden up my sleeves. Right here, access level 2 is just basic information. And my third option is level 4. So let's do that one more time. Scroll down. There we go. Now all 3 are being asked for. So that's what that means. You might have seen that before. That's where that comes from. Okay, so we're able to log in and log out. Now we do have one problem, is if I log in, let's go back with Kenny J test. I'm here, I'm logged in, it found my public key again. If I hit refresh, it's not remembering that I'm logged in. So what we want to do is we're going to add a little bit of code right here to take care of that. One thing we're doing when we're logging in behind the scenes, I am writing to local storage that identity information that I'm getting back. So the user key, the encrypted seed hex, and a few more things that come through in the payload. And I can show you what I mean. If we go into application and click here in local storage, we see identity users v2. And in here, I am just storing that information that comes back when we logged in. The public key, and we have our encrypted seed hex and a few other things. Now, when I refresh, it's still there, but I'm not looking for it. So let me do some code to look for it. And by the way, let's take a look at where this is happening, where that's getting saved. If we go to the DeSo identity library, we'll see that when we're handling the login, we're getting the payload information, and I am saving it here in local storage with the value of identity users key, which right here, this is in the documentation. It tells you to use the string identity users v2. So what I want to do is in my main app, whenever you refresh, when we go through this use effect, which happens when it's redrawing the screen, I want to go ahead and go to that local storage and see if I have that information saved there. And if it is, then I won't display the login button. I will set it to logged in, and I'll show all the things that we're used to seeing when it's logged in. And I'll show you what I'm going to add. I'm just going to copy and paste it here. It is quite a bit, and there's a couple quirky things going on. Sometimes, depending on how you do it, the key is equal to the string undefined. Sometimes it's null. So I go through I'm sure there's a cleaner way of doing this. You guys can grab the code and refactor it, make it much prettier than I can make it. But anyway, what I'm doing here is if it exists in there, I'm going to load it into this object called user, and I'm going to look to see if there is a public key attribute. And if there is, then I will tell the browser I'm logged in, or my code that I'm logged in. So I'll display all the stuff that I'm logged in, and then I'll set the public key equal to what I grab from local storage. Also, one thing that's going to give me an error if I try right now, because I'm not defining this identity user key. So right up here, I'll just declare it as a constant. Now, let me go ahead and we'll do this refresh again, we'll log in. You see over here, I'm going to log in Kenny Test. Now, if I hit refresh, yay, it knows that I've already been logged in, and it's going to behave as if I'm logged in. Okay, so far, all we've done is worked with that login feature, and we've set the access levels, and we've saved some of that information into local storage. And then I look to see, anytime I would come back to the site, I would look to see if that information is still in local storage. And if it is, then I'll go ahead and treat the user as if they're logged in, and I will be able to grab their public key and do whatever I need to on behalf of that user. Okay, except, so this is things like if I wanted to get all of the users' feed, right, which is just publicly available, and it's a read-only kind of call, so I don't need to do a transaction. But that's not the end of what we want to do here. We want to be able to create a post on the user feed. So that's where we're going to have to use identity in combination with that backend API. But in order to create that post, I'm going to have to bring in my other library. So I'm going to go ahead and create another file. And I've just been calling this one DeSo API JX. And I will go ahead and paste it in here. And this should look familiar. This is what we worked on last time. You can see that I'm still going to be using DeSo dev because it does not have cores enabled. Remember, we needed to install this Axios package. We did that before we started. And again, this is set up as a class that I would instantiate on that client. And we have a bunch of different methods that we could call. And the one that we plan on doing is submit post. We'll do that one first. We will get back our transaction hex, and then also we'll be using submit transaction. So let's go back to our main code, and now we're going to import that library. There we go. And then just like we instantiated our DeSo identity library here as a class, we're going to want to do it also with this DeSo API. So I'll add this in there, and then I'll instantiate it there. So this will now instantiate our DeSo API object, but we want to use it during this send good morning, the send GM. So first of all, we're not going to need that alert to pop up. So we will go ahead and comment that out. And then we'll go ahead, paste in our code here. And notice it's getting upset at me again. And that's because you can see right here, we have the await, which means it's using asynchronous. So we need to give this the async keyword, and it'll be happy again. Okay, so let's walk through what we're doing here. We're going to create a body variable, and this will just be the post itself, the message of that post. And it will be GM space, and then whatever is in the to user name. In this case, if I left it default, it'd be GM Melanie J. And then extra data, we've talked about this before. This is metadata. I don't know why I would need it, but better safe than sorry, right? So I'm going to go ahead, and just like I've been doing with other apps that I create where I'm posting to the blockchain, I have a key called app, and then I give it a value of whatever the app is. In this case, I'm just going to call it GM. And I've also just kind of, once again, this is just my own little thing. I will then have a type key, which in other applications I have might mean different things, but here I'm just going to also set it equal to GM. No one's ever going to see this. Who knows if I will ever use it? Maybe I will. Maybe this app will read in our posts and then go through and filter and only grab the ones that have a key called the app that's equal to GM. And then maybe we'll just have a column, and these are all the GMs that I've sent out today or whatever. That would be for another day. But that never hurts. It's not going to cost me anything to add a little bit extra data. All right, here's where the fun starts, right? This is where you paid your money to come, right? First of all, we're going to call our submit post on this DeSo API or this backend API, and we send it our public key, which we got when the user logged in. We also will send it the body, which is, in this case, good morning, Melanie J, and this metadata, this extra data. Great. We have the await keyword, so it's going to block here. And when we get the information back, this return submit post, we know that one of the keys is transaction hex, and that's what will come back. So I just put an extra step so we can kind of visually see what's going on. So now we have our transaction hex. Now we go to DeSo identity, and we're going to call the sign transaction async and pass in this transaction hex. And if all goes well, it will kick back a signed transaction hex. We didn't go through this yet, but this is what is happening in the signed transaction async. We're going to first call this get info. It mentions in the docs that you should do this. I think this is mostly if you are going to be dealing with different browsers. I'm not doing much here, and I probably should. I should probably make sure that the browser supports either cookies or local storage, and that's where you would get this, but I'm just going to cheat for right now. I am going to generate a unique ID, and I've got the code for that right here. I just took it from DeSo's documentation. Remember that identity data that came back and we saved to local storage? Here, I'm going to retrieve it. And you can see I'm going to pass in the payload that access level. Right now, it should be level 4. And this access level HMAC, then our encrypted seed hex and our transaction hex. And then it's going to post that to DeSo identity API. And then our listener down here is going to listen. And there's going to be 2 possible events. So one, if we were at level 4, it's going to come back with a signed transaction hex. And we will go ahead and just pass that back. And that's how we get this signed transaction hex. And I said there was another option. The other option, let's say we had only had the user log in as level 2. Well, then we're going to get a message back that says approval required. And what we'll do here is first, we'll go ahead and go to this approval required, and we'll go to this approved signed transaction right here and see I'm popping up another identity window, but before it said log in, here it says approve, and I'm going to pass it a query string variable of transaction, and that will be the transaction hex. And then when the user approves it, it will come back again. Our listener will catch that message, and this time it will be a signed transaction. So this particular line of code will execute, and just like before, we will now have that signed transaction hex. What do we have left to do? Now we just call the submit transaction and pass it that signed transaction hex, and we're going to get back the data that we had originally posted to start this whole thing. I admit I should be a little bit more careful about what I'm looking for here. Right now, I just don't want anything empty. And if it looks full of stuff, then I'm going to go ahead and set this message that before was saying, waiting for you to send your GM. It's going to say GM sent with a party hat and a party favor. All right, so let's test it out. First, I'm going to break our code out here. I'm going to do a little inspect so we can see what's going on. Okay, I'm going to log out and I'm going to refresh. Well, look at this. There must have been something I missed. Let's go take a look. Okay, there is something I missed. I forgot. In this logout, we want to do the, we'll want to go to DeSo identity. Again, it's getting angry at me because now I'm doing an asynchronous call, so I have to make this an asynchronous method. There we go. So I'm going to call this logout to log us out. And let's take a look at that code really quickly. Okay, so there's two things I could do. I could just remove this whole key, the user identity stuff from local storage, and it'll be as if I'm logging out. We can also go one step further and use the actual logout that's provided with identity. They suggest doing it this way. It adds an extra step for the user. So let's do both of them. Let's see both of them happen. So first we'll do it like this. I'm going to log out and it just logs me out. And if I went into local storage, it wouldn't be there anymore. Let's give this a shot. Let's take a look. So we'll go to local storage, application, local storage. We've got that there. I hit log out. Now it disappears. Okay. And if I log back in, there we go. It's there again. And that might be enough for your application. I'll show you what happens if we run this in addition to that. I'll give this a nice refresh. Now, if I hit log out, you'll see I also get this logout screen, and I go there and you'll see that this is where it gets a little weird. Identity user v2, it didn't get completely deleted. It just got changed to the value undefined. So remember I said I had to do that little weird thing and check on both. That's why. So we'll leave it like this. And then if I log back in, there we go. Okay, so let's go back. Let me log in. I'm logged in as Kenny J Test. That's my public key. I'm going to send this GM to Melanie J. I'm going to hit a nice refresh, make sure everything's looking well. I'm going to log out. I'm going to log back in again. Remember, we're all level 4. Hit Kenny J. I'm going to watch what happens here. Send GM. Okay, nothing happened. Why? There's one last step that we need to do. And if you remember, there were two parts to using Identity API. We've been focusing so much on this one, we haven't done this one yet. So we need to add this iframe in order to get it to work. So we're going to go to our main code page. And here where I'm actually returning the React component that will give us this UI, I'm going to go ahead and paste in our iframe. One little word to the wise that messed me up. So over the course of the life of DeSo, which up to this time has been about 9 months, before it was identity.deso.org, it was bitclout. And I can't remember, I was like bitclout.identity.com, maybe. I can't remember exactly. But when I was preparing this lesson, I was taking code from here and taking code from there. And I was using bitclout on the login here, but I was using identity.deso.org here. If you're using the two different ones, they won't work. You need to make sure that they match. So your iframe here needs to be calling the same one here. Now, I think all the documentation's been updated, but I was going to some older GitHub repositories, so that's why I ran into that. Now that we have everything hopefully set up right, we've got our iframe, we've got all of our little libraries imported. Let's give this another shot. Gonna hit refresh. I'm going to clear this and I will hit send GM. All right, looks like stuff happened and it said GM sent. Now let's go over here. And the last one here was GM Kenny J. I'm going to hit refresh. There we go. GM Melanie J. And right there, it was 1 minute ago. Okay, so that was it. We went through and we were able to use both the backend API and the identity API to post a message to our feed. And one little footnote just to show you that the encrypted seed hex really is different. This was on the same computer, but on two different browsers. So I did Chrome and Edge, and you can see everything else is the same. My public key is the same, and my Bitcoin address. I'm not afraid of anyone seeing this, right? If you want to send Bitcoin to this address, feel free to. Anyway, but you can see here the encrypted seed hex starts AE2ED, here the encrypted one, BB73C. So that is part of this whole security model while we're working on the front end. So I hope that was helpful, and let me know in the comments or on DeSo on chain what else you would like to see, and I will try to figure it out and present it to you. And that's it for now. Let's build DeSo together.